Hello, DawgNation. I am Brandon Adams. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and happy to have you with us today. Very busy. It's Jake Fromm, the former Georgia quarterback, stopping by before we're done. It's Connor Riley here today as well, as we kind of get a look from Connor about what it was like to be with Stetson Bennett in New York City this past weekend, and a little bit of indication of how things are going for Georgia as it continues its preparations for Ohio State and the college football playoff. I'll also tell you this, and many of you are aware of this by now, we're also doing the show with a huge degree of sadness today because of the official announcement that Mike Leach has passed away, suffering a heart attack, and complications stemming from that has cost Coach Leach his life, and we're shocked. We're saddened. We've had obviously a day or so to prepare for the idea that this was going to be the reality, but it doesn't lessen the magnitude of this in any form or fashion. So we'll talk about that a bit on the show today, and really just try to make peace with the idea of someone that was such a large figure in the lives of those of us who have been loving and obsessed with college football taken from us way too soon. It's incredibly sad. So I'll begin with a brief statement on that, and then we'll try to do the business at hand today, which is figuring out where Georgia goes after losing a staffer to Georgia Tech, kind of managing the transfer portal, recruiting stuff, heading towards National Signing Day, and all of this running concurrent to getting ready for the college football playoff. We're going to cram a bunch of stuff into the next hour or so, and we're happy to have you with us as we do it. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
As we record this live today, the news just becoming official really a few minutes ago that Mike Leach, the longtime figure in college football and most recently head coach at Mississippi State, has passed away. This was news that we feared to be likely true yesterday. A lot of folks were very much aware of just how serious of a situation that he was going through, and there were no shortage of rumors on the internet, and probably even some people jumping the gun in terms of trying to make it official before it actually was. Out of respect for Leach's family and the community there at Mississippi State, I think the official news sources were really trying to hold back and move as slowly on this as possible. But now it is real and it is official that Mike Leach has passed away. And it's always awkward because our show is about fun and it's about the things that we love about college football. Anytime something this serious creeps into our proceeding, especially right before the show starts, it makes the thing that we do around here each and every day really awkward. And yet you can't do a show like this about college football without acknowledging the fact that everyone that's connected to the sport today is just incredibly sad, whether they knew Leach or not, or whether they had a deep tie to Leach or not. We're all aware of him. This was a big personality. This is obviously a very influential figure in the X's and O's of the sport, really kind of one of the architects, maybe the architect of what we think of as the air raid offense. And it's just kind of scary a little bit too when a guy 61 years old goes this quickly. I think it scares us all. And so I don't really have anything especially profound to say. I mentioned this yesterday. I'd spent some time in Starkville this football season because Georgia played there. It was my first time being there. And I was really taken by just how deeply connected that community seems to be. There's something kind of neat about some of the smaller SEC schools. I don't mean that negatively. I just mean it factually, that Mississippi State's a little smaller than, say, Georgia is, or some of the other really big behemoth SEC programs. And I think that creates kind of a tightness of bond with their folks. And so they're going to need to lean on that right now, and they're going to need to lean on each other. And I have no doubt they will. But obviously the story of Leach kind of extends even beyond what, Mississippi State or the SEC or anything else. This is a guy that coached in the Big 12, that coached in the Pac-12, and everybody knew of Leach and knew his personality. And I guess the only thing you take any comfort from in a situation like this is that Leach took a big bite out of life, seemingly, and put a big dent into the sport, certainly. Instrumental in terms of how the game is played, and a guy who is very confident, very content to be something really, really different than the prevailing norm. And it takes a lot of courage to do that. I'll be honest with you, not everything that Leach did always worked for me. I have to acknowledge that. However, he was really comfortable in his own skin. And frankly, I am very impressed by anyone who's that content to be themselves, their true, authentic self, when it would be way easier just to kind of blend into the scenery. Well, Leach never did that. And so while we're shocked and saddened by this news, maybe we take some comfort from the fact that this is a guy that lived life truly on his own terms. And while his life may not have been as long as any of us think that it should have been, he certainly got a lot of life out of his years. And to everyone who is obviously impacted by this, obviously, we add to the prayers, and, we offer whatever words we can come up with here. This is just an incredibly sad day. And so wanted to at least mention that off the top of the program. And as we say from time to time, there is no easy way to go from something like that into what we normally do around here. And yet, you want to try to entertain. You want to try to keep you, happy and enjoying the situation for Georgia right now, because there is obviously a lot to be enjoyed by that. And I guess as I'm thinking about today's show and kind of thinking about what's going on with Georgia right now, I guess I'm kind of reminded of what we thought would be true going into this month, that it would be incredibly busy. And for the 2018 class, when you added the early signing period, we were taking what was already a very busy month for the sports best teams. They're getting ready for the college football playoff. And then we said to them, okay, in addition to doing that, you now also have to get ready for the lion's share of your recruiting class around the same time. And we thought, boy, that's really hard to do all of that all at the same time. And yet somehow, some way, the sport's very best, including Georgia, have figured out a way to do that. And then now you add another log onto that fire, because in addition to early signing day, where you're adding high school talent and getting ready for the college football playoff, you're also managing transfer portal right now too. That means not only looking to see who you might want to add from the portal, but you're also looking to see who you might be losing off your roster in the portal. And you're having to a degree, probably have to re-recruit some of those kids there as well. So the month of December we thought would be really busy for Georgia and all the teams that Georgia competes with at the top of college football. And that has kind of turned out to be as true as we thought it would be. So for a couple of minutes here, I want to kind of walk through some of what's going on with Georgia right now. And we'll sort of see where this leads you as you get ready for Ohio State coming up at the end of the month, which is probably the thing that's probably most, the forefront mostly on my mind here at the moment. But all this other stuff is going to really matter too. So you got to do all of it at the same time. And I guess the lead in on this was, it has been really interesting to me over the course of the last day or so to watch what I believe is a very strong reaction to a story that Jeff Sintel had at DawgNation.com. Good reporting by Jeff, long, thorough story with five-star running back Justice Haynes, where in the midst of the story, and you should read this for yourself, we'll talk to Jeff about this on Friday, and Jeff will have his own thoughts on the story coming up tomorrow, Wednesday, when he does Before the Hedges presented by Kroger. But the basic gist of the story is that Justice Haynes, in the text with Jeff, kind of reaffirms his status as an Alabama commit and is kind of unwavering, it would seem, in terms of sticking with the Crimson Tide, even though there's been plenty of rumor and innuendo that he might make a different decision. Haynes has, based on what he told Jeff, seems like he's just as locked in with Alabama as he ever was. And I guess it leads me to a couple of thoughts here. Thought number one is, I think it's really important when it comes to recruiting. If you want to follow this stuff closely, y'all, you can't have too thin of a skin, right? I mean, there were a lot of Georgia fans who were like upset with Haynes that, well, good riddance then, or maybe upset with Jeff for even writing the story, which I thought was kind of weird. But there's a lot of like angst, related to this situation, and I just think that's the inappropriate response. I mean, look, guys are going to do what they're going to do, and if you want to really be in the mix for the very best players, you can't tap out and give up just at the very moment the guy sort of acts like he's going to go somewhere else. I just don't think you can do that. I think that's kind of the inappropriate way to look at all of that. And in fact, my read on the story involving Haynes with Jeff yesterday is actually a little bit different than what I think the prevailing wisdom was among Georgia fans. What I read from Haynes at DawgNation.com was actually not all that different than what I've been hearing from Haynes in the past. And you may remember, this is going back to a few weeks ago. We actually did a topic on Haynes here on the show. And what I said was, somehow, some way, there is this seeming atmosphere around Justice of maybe he's wavering in his Alabama commitment. But what we pointed out was, based on other interviews that Haynes had given to other media outlets at the time, there was nothing that Justice was saying that was in any way giving life to this rumor that, hey, maybe Justice is going to flip from Alabama to Georgia. And yet somehow, some way, there was still a little bit of a feeling in the air that that was true. And what we said was, it's kind of interesting that it just seems to be true that there's this doubt about Haynes and his Alabama connection that's not necessarily connected to Haynes' own words. And you couldn't quite notice that. This is around the time of the Tennessee game. This is around the time of, we did a game with Justice on TV the other night. We're kind of talking about that there. You just sort of couldn't help but notice that was true. And in reading the story with Jeff at dawgnation.com yesterday, I have to say that I don't know that all that much has changed for me in how I view Justice, because for the most part, Justice spent that time in the interview saying the same stuff he's been saying the entire time. And that just sort of leaves things where they've been for me. In fact, I want to show you one part of this here where Jeff kind of asks Justice, is there anything that might cause you to change your mind about where you're going? And this is what Justice Haynes says back to this. He says, it would take God giving me a sign, God coming to me in a dream, and God talking to my heart and just getting that feeling from God saying, this is the school you need to be at. He hasn't given me that feeling. He's given me every feeling to go to Alabama. So that's what Justice Haynes tells Jeff Sentell yesterday via the pages of dawgnation.com. And maybe my read on this is wrong. Certainly possible. I've been wrong before. But to me, I walk away from the story with Jeff and Justice yesterday thinking, okay, so Justice Haynes has reaffirmed his commitment to Alabama, something he's done over and over and over again. And yet, given the opportunity to say, no, absolutely not, there is zero way, no way whatsoever I would ever consider going somewhere else, he kind of stops just short of doing that. Now, listen, whether Haynes goes to Georgia or not, or I should say whether he goes to Alabama or not, I don't think that Georgia's done anything wrong by pursuing this all the way down to the 11th hour. And I don't think any Georgia fan should be getting all that upset if ultimately Haynes makes a different decision. This is the way that it goes sometimes in recruiting. And if you get your feelings hurt easily, recruiting may not be the thing for you. That's just the way that goes. So, I think that Georgia has done right by itself by seemingly trying to be involved in the Haynes situation here down to the very end. And most of what you read from Jeff at dawgnation.com yesterday would lead you to believe that it's completely over, that Haynes is definitely going to Alabama. But y'all, Justice has been saying that now for quite some time, and yet somehow, some way, the rumor mill hasn't completely been stamped out. So I guess I'm left to conclude that maybe things here with him are still the same way they sort of always have been. I'll ask Jeff on Friday if that's the proper read on all of this. But there's also this. Well, what if Georgia's pursuit of the very best possible running back it can add to its roster, what if that's not a high school recruit? Or what if that's not just a high school recruit? Because let's not forget that Georgia also has in the fold for the class of 2023 a guy like Roderick Robinson, who has really put on an incredible display here to end his high school career. And more Georgia fans than before, I think, are feeling really good about Robinson. But obviously you also kind of view running back as a position of need for UGA because of what you might be losing off of that position group at the end of this season. So what if Georgia's pursuit of the very best they can get is about more than just the high school names? Robinson, who's in the fold, or a guy like Justice Haynes, who maybe he does stick with Alabama before it's all said and done. There was some interesting news out of the portal yesterday when Marshawn Lloyd, a name that you'll remember as a guy that Georgia recruited very heavily before Lloyd picked South Carolina a couple of years ago. All of a sudden now Lloyd has decided to put his name into the transfer portal. I'll show you this on Twitter. Marshawn Lloyd said new beginnings, and he goes on to give you kind of the message that he's getting ready to leave Columbia. There were a couple of interesting likes, or at least one pretty interesting like on some stuff with Lloyd on social media the last day or so, which would give you an idea that Georgia certainly has noticed what's going on with Marshawn Lloyd. But this is kind of an example of what's out there right now. Is that Georgia, while it's getting ready for a national championship push, as we say around here, go for 2 in 22. In fact, I've got the go for 2 in 22 shirt on here today. While Georgia's in the midst of doing this, it's also in the midst of making itself better for the future as well. And that means it's going to go hard after the remaining 5-star names that are out there, Justice Haynes being one of those. And if Haynes says no harm, no foul, you just move on to the next one, which for Georgia might include a guy like Lloyd, maybe anyway, in the transfer portal, or maybe some other name we haven't even considered yet, that also gives Georgia a chance to better itself. We said before, this was going to be a very busy time for UGA. I'd say right now it's playing out to be just as busy as we thought it would be. So are there more 5-star names to be added? Maybe so. Are there big transfer portal names to be added, whether it be Lloyd or somebody else? Maybe so there as well. This is a fun time to watch the future of Georgia take shape, as the present tense is already pretty good as well. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and we're happy to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. Live on video, we start 9:45, first and 15 at dawgnation.com and on the DawgNation app. Then 10 a.m. after that, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, on the radio at noon, on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, and we are available as a podcast wherever you find them. All across the Apple, Spotify, everything else. Just really, really happy to have you with us, and so grateful to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia for making it all possible. Listen, I love Engineered Solutions of Georgia for a lot of reasons. Maybe primarily, if you want me to just be completely honest and self-serving here for a moment, they've been longtime friends of ours here at DawgNation Daily. Some of our best, most loyal partners, and we are so grateful for that relationship. It's one of the things I'm really the most proud of, is that a great company like Engineered Solutions of Georgia has been with us for such a long time. They're also proud partners of UGA as well. It's always kind of fun to do business with those that support the Dogs, and that is certainly what Engineered Solutions of Georgia is all about. No one will be happier when Georgia brings home another national championship, or as we say around here, go for 2 in 22. No one's going to love that more than our friends at ESOG when that finally takes place. But here's another thing I love about Engineered Solutions of Georgia. They are also a great resource for you for two of the most challenging things you might deal with as a homeowner. I'm talking about foundation and waterproofing issues. That means when it rains, when that water shows up where it's not supposed to be, wet spot in the garage, dampness down in the basement, all kinds of stuff down your crawl space, water creeping in, intruding where it's not supposed to be. That's an issue, and our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia are there to step up for you on an issue like that. Or maybe you've seen those cracks in your walls. Go down there to the basement where you see that foundation, and it's kind of unsettled, and you see the signs of that down there. All the more reason to give our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia a call, because they've got an entire team of engineers on staff. There's nobody on our market that can put that level of resource to work for you to solve the problem you might have. And the good news is, if it's a simple fix, they'll tell you that. But a solutions-based company like Engineered Solutions of Georgia also wants to do great work for you when it's a more substantial issue. And that is the reason you should reach out and dial this number. Give them a call, 678-ESOG-NOW. That's 678-ESOG-NOW. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. All right, we've got a busy show for you today. It's Jake Fromm coming up in a bit. That's the former Georgia quarterback. We'll talk to him about a number of subjects, including the one I want to get into right now as we go around the doghouse, presented today by Georgia's own credit union, because a lot of you are aware of what's taken place over the last 24 hours or so as it relates to Georgia, that Buster Faulkner, who prior to coming to UGA was offensive coordinator at Southern Miss, came to Georgia as an analyst. My read on that situation, Hasburg at the time is that Southern Miss has had a kind of a weird coaching scenario. They'd kind of gone through a series of head coaches. They had like 3 head coaches over the course of about a year or so. Maybe a little bit of a weird situation for a guy like Faulkner, maybe a situation where he thought he needed to get out from that and kind of, sort of reboot his career. So coming to a place like Georgia in the SEC gave him the additional cachet. And while being here, it certainly seems like Faulkner has raised his coaching profile in a very big way. He's been a factor in some recruiting for Georgia, of course, and he's also been a pretty instrumental figure for the on-field product for UGA, we're led to believe, too, even though he technically hasn't been one of Georgia's 10 on-field coaches. Well, now Faulkner is leaving UGA to go become offensive coordinator at Georgia Tech. That's a big hire by the new head coach there, Brent Key. So there is probably a lot to be said over the course of the coming days about what the move Faulkner from Georgia to Georgia Tech might mean. But in the immediate, conversation, what does it mean for Stetson Bennett right now? Yesterday on the show, I played some audio for you of Bennett accepting the Brandon Burlsworth trophy as the Sports Top walk-on, and there was an insane moment in that kind of speech that Bennett gave where he kind of gave a little bit of a shout-out to Buster Faulkner. And I want to play this for you. It's not a very long clip, but I want to play it for you as a way of indicating the fact that while Faulkner may not be a huge household name to a lot of casual fans, for Georgia itself, Buster has been a pretty pivotal figure behind the scenes. Let me let you hear Stetson shouting out Buster Faulkner the other day when Stetson was honored as the top walk-on in college football. Here's Stetson.
Buster, you're the man. Thank you for being the voice of reason on a crazy sideline. Thank you. We've seen it all. We've been through it.
Connor Riley, who we'll talk to here in a moment, had a story about Buster Faulkner the other day at dawgnation.com. And one of the things that Stetson also talked about while being in New York City is kind of going into more detail about why it is that he felt so close to Buster Faulkner, kind of mentioning him in that speech there. And the one thing that Stetson kind of explained to us is that during the game, Stetson and Monken actually aren't talking to each other very much, that Faulkner is kind of the guy down there on the sideline who almost like intercedes between Monken and Stetson on this and kind of conveys the message from Monken to Stetson Bennett. I think the perception that I got of this, and if you go to the DawgNation YouTube page, you can watch some of the interviews with Stetson this week where he kind of talks more about this. Some of that kind of stuff sort of works better as a video than it does audio here in this show because there's always a lot of room noise, things like that. But the impression I got from listening to Stetson Bennett on this is, hey, Monken's this sort of hard-driving, hard-edge guy, and during a game, Stetson Bennett's kind of the same way a little bit. These are two pretty strong personalities. And sometimes, maybe having a guy like Faulkner kind of standing between all of that, sort of relaying some of that communication back and forth as a little bit of a buffer between the two. Maybe that's kind of a good idea. Maybe that's not the complete and total accurate read of the scenario, but that's kind of what I kind of got from that. So that's kind of the role that Faulkner has kind of played here. So what does this mean for Georgia moving forward, whether it be college football playoff, whether it be, beyond that? Obviously, it's not great to lose a staffer like this. And yet at the same time, I think most of you are probably kind of aware of this, is you can't expect to keep guys like this forever either. I mean, this is why it's hard to stay good for a long period of time. And that's exactly what Georgia's trying to do, is the things that make you good, people are coming to take those things from you, whether it be your on-field assistant coaches, they want to make them head coaches, your analysts, they want to make them coordinators. Now it's your players, they want to, take them off your roster and put them somewhere else too. The things that make you good, people want to poach those things. And for a guy like Faulkner, who was making pretty good money as an analyst, when you have a chance to be a Power 5 offensive coordinator, even if it is a place like Georgia Tech, you're not going to say no to that, unfortunately. So, this is sort of the challenge as it relates to Georgia, is that you've got this incredible level of resource. And frankly, Georgia's probably, I guess, kind of lucky to even have a guy of Faulkner's capabilities who was functioning in a role the way that he was functioning, kind of beyond just being an on-field coach, being an analyst, but an analyst who was pretty important on game day, as Stetson Bennett would talk. So, I think my take on this is kind of a simple one. This is a loss for Georgia. This does make the business of Georgia, both in the immediate present and the future, a little bit more difficult to do. But these are the kinds of difficulties great programs are always dealing with. The things that make you great, the human resource that you have in your building, people are kind of coming for that. And listen, who knows? Maybe if Todd Monken moves on at some point in time, maybe Georgia could circle back on Buster Faulkner. I do believe that Faulkner would have been in the mix to replace Monken if Monken were to, leave even right now. I think that Georgia liked Buster Faulkner, and I think that Faulkner's probably got a very bright future in coaching. But for the moment, that future is going to take shape at Georgia Tech, and one of the important guys behind the scenes that it's helped make the Georgia offense what it is all of a sudden no longer with UGA. So these are the kinds of stories, in some respects, we expected to be happening here this offseason or in this build-up towards the college football playoff, and right now it is playing out just that way. That is Around the Dawghouse, and it's presented today by our friends at Georgia's own credit union. And in addition to getting ready for the college football playoff and all the fun things that are going on, we're also getting ready for the holiday season right now, too. That means buying a bunch of stuff. That means food to go on your table for the parties or the family get-togethers. That means the presents to go under the tree. That means all of that. And the purchases you're already making, you can have a more enjoyable experience making those purchases when you use our friends at Georgia's own credit union and those Visa Signature and Platinum cards for which they're so famous. Because when you use these Visa Signature and Platinum cards, you get so many really fun things like Flex Rewards, which you can use for just about anything, kind of as a bonus to you for the purchases you already make. I'm talking about gift cards, cash back, travel, merchandise, so much more as well. You can even earn up to $150 when you open a new Platinum or Signature card. And there are some restrictions that apply, so find out more at georgiasown.org. That's georgiasown.org for more details on that. Visa Signature and Platinum cards from our friends at Georgia's Own Credit Union. Make sure you check that out today. All right, I told you before, we're very busy. It's Jake Fromm coming up. A lot to get into with Jake. But I kind of want to follow up on what we were just talking about a moment ago, too, about what this means for Georgia losing a staffer of the caliber of Faulkner now to Georgia Tech. Let's do that and more with a guy who was with Stetson Bennett in New York City this past weekend. Looking forward to talking to him about that, too. It's Connor Riley here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Connor Riley here today, and there's a lot of fun stuff I want to do with Connor. He was obviously with Stetson Bennett in New York City. That's a great thing, and I want to do more of the Buster Faulkner stuff there too. But Connor, this is also one of those days, as we said to start our show, that the college football world is really just reeling from the news of the passing of Mike Leach, who is such an instrumental figure in football. So if you don't mind, before we get into the typical topics at hand, would you mind kind of sharing some thoughts from your perspective on what Mike Leach has meant to football and how his passing personally touches you?
Yeah, he's a titan of the game, an innovator in every sense of the word in terms of just from an on-field impact of how he revolutionized the game of football. I mean, one of my fondest football memories is that Texas Tech upset over Texas back in 2008 where Graham Harrell hits Michael Crabtree with 2 seconds left. Yeah. And that was probably the best team he had ever coached. In a playoff era, that Texas Tech team probably would have gotten into a playoff and made things very difficult for a lot of teams. And the concepts that you see from Leach are employed everywhere, including at Georgia. So his legacy on the game of football will far outstretch the short time that he got to be on this earth. And obviously all the personality quirks, how anything was on the table with him in a press conference and whatnot, obviously adds to his character and lore. But I don't think we can understate just how impactful his legacy was on the game of football and what he meant and how he innovated this game.
No, I think that's really well said, Connor, and I'm glad that you shared those words with us. You also wrote an interesting story at DawgNation.com the last little bit about Buster Faulkner, and you were writing it from the perspective of some of the things that Stetson Bennett had said, both in New York with you and then kind of prior to that in a speech that he made around the Burlsworth Award, that Buster's one of those guys a lot of our audience is very well aware of because a lot of our audience is very plugged into the topic of Georgia football. But to maybe the average person, losing a staffer who wasn't even a coach, maybe that doesn't seem like such a big deal. So let me ask you, Faulkner leaving Georgia to go become offensive coordinator at Georgia Tech, what does that mean for Georgia right now? How big of a loss is it to no longer have Faulkner in the mix?
It's interesting because, and Todd Monken spoke about this last week, and Todd Monken is obviously still, I think, the maestro, the guy leading the charge. He is still Georgia's offensive coordinator, and Georgia fans should be very happy with that. And Monken talked about how it is a collaborative effort in that offensive staff room. He thanked Mike Bobo. He thanked Ryan Williams. Obviously, Buster Faulkner plays a big role. And so it's not one key guy just doing everything. But I do think that Faulkner played a very understated role in that, if you've listened to Todd Monken, if you've seen him coach in various videos put out by Georgia, he tells it like it is, and it's very rough and is very salty with his language, and that's not for everyone. And in talking with Stetson and getting to know Stetson, he shared some really cool details about his relationship with Buster and how the two of them sort of bonded and how Buster helped get the most out of Stetson, both from an on-field standpoint, but also from a off-the-field maturity standpoint. And so I think in that sense, to lose a coach like that, it does have some impact. Assuming Carson Beck is the starter here next year at Georgia, I believe Buster Faulkner absolutely would have been an asset for Georgia and helping get the most out of him. So I think in that aspect, it is important to watch going forward. It's also worth pointing out here, Todd Monken mentioned as a candidate for the Purdue job, and I would say I had long thought that if Todd Monken, when he does leave, because he's not going to be the offensive coordinator forever, that's just the reality of being a really good program with good coordinators, Buster Faulkner probably would have been the guy to step in right there as the offensive coordinator at Georgia. Now, let's say Monken does take the Purdue job. I still think, the door is going to be wide open for Faulkner to come back and be the offensive coordinator at Georgia. But so long as Todd Monken is here, it is a loss just because of, I think, the way Stetson spoke about him helping off the field stuff and helping him grow and work in that manner.
Do we have any indication if Faulkner will be sticking around for the playoff or not? I guess we'll hear maybe from Kirby Smart on that this week, but is there any kind of early indication on that?
Yeah, we'll find out for sure tomorrow. In the past, we've seen on-field staffers stick with the program throughout. Obviously, Dan Lanning last year is the most classic example after taking the Oregon head coaching job. But with Faulkner being an off-field assistant, I'm not so sure that he would necessarily stick around. But we'll find that out here shortly, probably this time tomorrow.
And putting aside here for a moment, Georgia has 10 coaches that it really likes. And just sort of pushing that aside for a moment, when it comes to like the responsibilities that Georgia has chosen to divide up for its 10 on-field coaches, how do you feel about the fact that Georgia does not employ a quarterback's coach? Because that's a job that maybe Faulkner could have filled at Georgia. when some programs do. In fact, I believe Tech, the place that he's going to, I think they do have a quarterbacks coach. I think Chris Winke's expected to stick around and be, that guy for them. So some programs have quarterbacks coaches, some programs don't. Georgia, for instance, has 2 defensive backs coaches. And on one hand, that kind of makes sense because you play with a lot of defensive backs right now. And so dividing safeties and cornerbacks into 2 assistants, that kind of makes some sense just given how many of those players are on the field at any given moment. But when you use 2 defensive backs coaches, that means you lose a coach you could have somewhere else, and Georgia does not have a quarterbacks coach. So putting aside the individual coaches, Georgia has 10 that it likes. What do you think about Georgia not having a quarterbacks coach when some programs do?
Yeah, they've gone both ways with this. Obviously, James Coley in 2018 was the quarterbacks coach, and Jim Chaney was the offensive coordinator there. So Kirby Smart has, I think, always shown a willingness to be flexible with the way he has divided up his staff. I think the big thing in the decision that was probably made was, is it more important to have Fromm Brown as an on-field coach for this team and have Will Muschamp do safeties and be co-defensive coordinator in that aspect, or Buster Faulkner be the quarterbacks coach in addition to what Todd Monken does with the offensive coordinator role? And I would probably agree with the decision that Kirby made in that aspect. I think Fromm Brown has been a huge plus to this Georgia program. And while, yes, losing Buster Faulkner does sting a little bit, even if he was, say, the quarterbacks coach this past year at Georgia, if Tech offers him an offensive coordinator job, he's still probably leaving to take that. And so I think the decision to go with Fromm Brown and have him be sort of the secondary coach along with Will Muschamp there, I get the thought process there that Kirby Smart had gone with.
Yeah, I think you're right. We'll shift gears after this. I just don't look at anybody. You mentioned Brown as kind of the newest guy here. I just don't look at anybody who's not, currently singing for his supper pretty well on this Georgia coaching staff. So, I think that Faulkner seems like a pretty sharp guy, and I sort of hate to lose him. But there's not I'm speaking as a fan here for a moment, there's not a current Georgia assistant that I would kick to the curb to employ Buster Faulkner. It's just Georgia just has a very deep staff right now, and that's just the way that it goes. When you've got a lot of great people resourcing your building, people are just going to kind of come after them.
Yeah, that's the reality. You have good coaches, they move on to different jobs. Dan Lanning, Broyles Award finalist last year, becomes the head coach at Oregon. Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp step in as the co-defensive coordinators. And there's very little drop-off within this Georgia defense. And so I think that speaks to just Kirby Smart's, we talk all the time about his ability to develop players. His ability to develop and identify coaches has, in my opinion, been just as strong, going out, getting Todd Monken after he, season with the Cleveland Browns didn't work out all that well to be the offensive coordinator, bringing Will Muschamp back, elevating Glenn Schumann, elevating Dan Lanning for that matter. He has continuously pushed the right buttons when it comes to finding and identifying coaches that help get the most out of this Georgia program.
Moving on here, you had a chance to be in New York City with Stetson Bennett this past weekend. That seems to me like it'd be a very cool experience just because the Heisman ceremony is one of those things that I've seen on television my entire life, but I really don't have a lot of insight into how the inner workings of that go. I think a lot of Georgia fans had long craved to have a guy back in the mix of the Heisman, and this weekend we were reminded of why we felt that way, because it was really cool to see Georgia in the spotlight as much as it was because of Bennett's involvement in this process. So, Connor, you were there. You obviously provided great coverage of all of this. Kind of from a behind-the-scenes standpoint, what was it like being in New York for the event?
Yeah, it's New York, obviously a massive city, and we were talking with some of the other writers. They're like, Stetson Bennett could have walked out on the street there, and nobody would have known who he was or what the big deal about him was. And that sort of just speaks to the way New York swallows everyone up whole. And so it was cool for Stetson to get to be there. It was a whirlwind, 36, 48 hours there. He got in Friday morning, left on Sunday, and was busy pretty much the entire time he was there. But I do think that Stetson really treasured sort of the quieter moments that he did get to experience there. We learned that he, of all people, hosted Caleb Williams when he visited Georgia back in 2019, so they had already had a previous connection there. And then really getting to know and see, Max Duggan, C.J. Stroud, who he's going to play in the college football playoff. I will say, I've covered Stetson for a few years now, and I feel like I probably learned more about him as a person this past week in terms of, obviously the Burlsworth Trophy acceptance, which you can go find on our YouTube page, and then getting to talk to him 3-4 times in smaller media settings this past weekend. You learn a lot more about him personally and how he has gone about, how he has gotten to the point where, in my opinion, he was a deserved Heisman finalist in going from, a guy nobody really thought much of at the start of his career to, in my opinion, one of the 4 most impactful players in college football this season.
He's also one of the most thoughtful speakers I just have ever heard of the ranks of players. This is a guy that puts a lot of thought into the things that he says. Almost everything that he says is interesting. And I just, kind of find myself, thinking about that again this weekend too, not just for the stuff in New York, but the stuff from the Burlsworth Award. It's always a hard name for me to say, Burlsworth. The Burlsworth Award was also just really interesting as well. Bennett is just a guy that just seems to understand the full magnitude of his own story, and I think he tells it very well. I find Stetson to be incredibly interesting, and as a Georgia fan, this is a guy that I really enjoy rooting for because he clearly, has grown up loving UGA and the significance of him achieving what he's achieved at kind of a dream spot for him being quarterback of Georgia. I just think it's an amazing, amazing story, and I'm glad more people became acquainted with it here this week.
Yeah, and he's talked about that, and he's probably, at this point, probably tired of talking about it. But, I think one of the questions we really dove into this weekend was, he gets benched in 2020, and how does he go about coming back from that? And he was blunt. He knew he wasn't playing well enough. He knew he had to get better. And sort of realizing that moment, there are things that I can improve on and get better. I think it's helped him get to this point, and that's something not every, I guess he was 23 at the time, not every 23-year-old realizes about themselves, especially when for most of his life prior to coming to Georgia, he had succeeded and been a really talented player. And so I think the totality of Stetson's journey, not just the walk-on aspect, but even from coming back to Georgia in 2019 and the ups and downs he has gone from there, I've touched on this before. This time a year ago, there were a lot of people saying that Stetson should be benched for JT and JT Daniels. And we see how full circle this whole story has come, where a year from now, JT Daniels is once again in the transfer portal looking for a new home, and Stetson Bennett is a Heisman Trophy finalist and a guy who has a chance, if not he's already the best quarterback in Georgia program history. And it speaks to, I think, Stetson's perseverance. Not everyone would be willing to go through the journey that Stetson has undertaken in his time at Georgia, but it speaks a lot to who he is as a person, that he has been able to go through everything and come out with, a chance to win a second national title. It says just a lot about the person that Stetson Bennett is.
I want to ask you about Georgia-Ohio State here in a moment, but let me remind folks before that, though, our friends at Peachtree Orthopedics, they got some great things going on for you right now, because as you're moving to the new year, maybe returning to do the things that you love to do is a big part of your New Year's resolution, whether that's playing golf or running marathons or whatever your thing is. If you're experiencing the kind of, injuries or pain, maybe it's keeping you from living the life that you want to live, doing the things you want to do. That's why you need to know about my friends at Peachtree Orthopedics, because they've been Atlanta's go-to orthopedic practice for 70 years. I'm talking about leading physicians and specialists for every single body part you have. And they've got a great process for getting you back doing the things you love. They want to listen, understand your problem. They want to explain the options that you have to eliminate what you're dealing with. And they want to make a plan for your recovery and getting you back to enjoying the things you have in your life. And they've also got a really cool thing right now that you need to be aware of. It's called Urgent Ortho Clinic, where they make all of this even easier, because you can get same-day, evening, Saturday hours. You can come when it kind of makes sense for you to be there. You also avoid the ER, and you can get seen quicker and kind of get back in the game doing what you're all about. So that's what our friends at Peachtree Orthopedics are all about. So you can find them online, peachtreeorthopedics.com. peachtreeorthopedics.com for more on that. Connor will finish with this. Preparations ongoing in the midst of getting ready for signing day and battling the transfer portal, both the door kind of opening both ways on that. Players potentially leaving, players potentially coming in. Georgia's also getting ready for Ohio State and the Peach Bowl. We're actually going to hear from Kirby Smart and some Georgia players here this week, which is maybe a little bit of a surprise to me, but kind of excited to get a chance to kind of find out how that's going. So what is the sense you get of where Georgia is in its arc of getting ready for one of the biggest football games you can play against Ohio State in a college football national playoff semifinal? What do you get the sense that Georgia is on all of this at the moment?
Yeah, so right now they're not worried about Ohio State. They're going to take probably this first week of practices and really just focus on developing themselves further. It's something they do during the bye week. It'll be similar to camp-style practices that we would see in August, which I think really help mold this team. And so you're going to see and hear, Kirby Smart come out tomorrow, and players come out tomorrow and say, we're not really focused on Ohio State just yet. In talking with Stetson, he had really only started to look at Ohio State film the Thursday night before he flew down to New York. And so this is a team that knows, hey, we got some things on our end we have to clear up before we even start really focusing in Ohio State and what they can do better there. The pass defense was not great against LSU, and again, I don't think that was all necessarily on Georgia's end. I think that was the way the game script had played there. But are there other areas that this Georgia team can develop and keep getting better in? And there certainly are in this coming game against Ohio State. So you'll hear, some things tomorrow like, it's weird. You have all this time to prepare for Ohio State. You're not necessarily diving into that. But that I think speaks to where this Georgia program is. It's not so much playing against the guys on the other side of the field. It's playing against themselves and trying to get the best out of each and every practice.
Beyond injury updates on McClendon and McConkey, who I'm guessing we don't probably hear too much tangible about, what else do you want to hear from with Kirby Smart right now?
I think the interesting thing, and Bill Norton's the only player from Georgia right now that has gone into the portal. Do guys that go into the portal, are they no longer practicing? I would lean yes in that circumstance, which is why Norton is the only player that you've seen enter the transfer portal so far from Georgia. How has that impacted practice, if at all, and whatnot? And that's probably it. Maybe a couple questions about Buster Faulkner and where he goes and when he goes to Georgia Tech there. But those are probably, I would say, injuries, the Norton/transfer portal aspect of this, and Faulkner, I would say, were probably the big three stories to come out of tomorrow.
And let me just do this, I guess, kind of wrap up. This is not really a question you can ask Kirby because it's a little bit of an abstract answer. But to me, when I think about what it's going to take against Ohio State, I keep going back to that Tennessee game. That what Georgia did against Tennessee, sort of a replica of that is what you have to do against Ohio State. Georgia has not been a great pass rushing team this season, but they were against the Vols. And I think you have to be against C.J. Stroud, and what I still view as a pretty high-powered Ohio State passing offense. And, Georgia came out against Tennessee that day, also pretty explosive offensively in its own right, then established the running game after that as a way of putting that game on ice. Connor, I think the most ardent Georgia partisan here would say, hey, that's the blueprint. If you can do that same thing against Ohio State, then you're playing for a national championship. But the intrigue here is, can you just call that up on demand out of nowhere because you did that against the Vols, and now can you just sort of do that again? Can you really just flip the switch when you need to and be that best version of yourself for the second time here this season? That's what I think is so fascinating about heading towards December 31st.
Yeah, and I'll say this. I think that Tennessee team was a good bit tougher than this Ohio State team that we've seen now. The Ohio State Buckeyes are a more talented bunch than Tennessee, but I think with what I've seen from Ohio State in the past 2 years, I think there's a very similar world where if Georgia comes out and throws a haymaker and punches Ohio State in the face in the first half the way they did against Tennessee, I'm not sure what you've seen from Ohio State that would give you any indication that they would respond well to that. And so I do think that this is a game where Georgia's toughness really stuck out in that first game against Tennessee. I think you could see something similar in that aspect where, hey, look, Ohio State, we know you have a lot of talent on the outside. You have some talented receivers. You're going to want to throw the ball around there. You don't want to play a four-quarter game with us, and we know that, and we're going to make it very clear on December 31st in Atlanta why that is the case.
Connor, great stuff. We'll look forward to more coverage from you from Athens here this week, getting ready for that. Obviously got signing day coming up here, too, so there's a lot going on. So, Connor, we're thankful to have you out there for all of it. Great job in New York this past weekend, and we'll chat with you again very soon.
Yep, as always, it's a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So I will just say here that, Connor has been pretty consistent how he's talked about this Georgia-Ohio State game, and Connor is really confident in Georgia in the game, probably more so than I am. I believe that Georgia will win the game, but I guess I just can't resign myself to the possibility that it's going to be easy, and we talked about this on one of our shows last week. Obviously, the avenue for Georgia is to take advantage of what Georgia has always shown itself to be, a very tough physical team, against an Ohio State team that in the biggest moments, back-to-back years against Michigan, has proven not to be that. But the one question that will kind of linger in my mind a bit is, well, gosh, how are they going to respond after listening for a month of people telling them that they're too soft for a game like this? And how does Ryan Day as the coach respond to this? Because right now, Day has the reputation of being, what was the thing that Jim Harbaugh said about him last year? That he was, born on third base and thinks he has hit a triple. That in other words, that he's this guy that kind of has inherited this great situation and has not really done much with that. I mean, is that really the way that Day is going to allow himself to be defined? Is this team going to allow itself to be defined as, oh, they're good at kicking around people that aren't very talented, but when they face another talented team, they don't have the requisite toughness to compete in a situation like that? I mean, we're really in a situation where Ohio State's manhood has been questioned. And I'm left to conclude that surely they have enough pride to step up and respond in a bigger way, in a better way they did against Michigan this year, frankly, Michigan a year ago. But, maybe Connor or anybody else who might say this, maybe they're right. Maybe they just don't have that in them. But, boy, their level of motivation, you got to imagine, is sky high right now because of the kinds of criticism they're dealing with. Kirby Smart would have told you last year going to the Orange Bowl that Georgia had a little bit different kind of motivation because of what was said about it after the SEC championship. Well, right now, maybe Ohio State's got some of that going for it, too. I find this to be fascinating. I believe that Georgia will win the game, and yet I believe that Ohio State is a very good team who is likely to give Georgia pretty stiff test, and can't wait to see how it plays out. But that's going to be quite a showdown here coming up on December 31st. We're going to talk to Jake Fromm in a moment. Before that, though, let's go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. What a great time we had this past week getting a chance to be on board Wonder of the Seas. I was so thankful that y'all let me do that. Sneak away here during the month of December to kind of recharge the batteries a little bit, work on my tan, as Kenny Chesney would say, for Christmas. That's all I wanted was a little Christmas tan, and fun to get a chance to do some of that, visiting Perfect Day Coco Cay, private island oasis. And this is our first time kind of getting there's a thrill side and a chill side. My wife and I were a little bit more of the chill side type folks. We kind of sit around in beach chairs and put our toes in the sand and things like that. But the thrill side's the water park. You got tallest water slide in North America. You've got big wave pool, all that kind of stuff. So we kind of sort of snuck over and enjoyed the thrill side a little bit over the course of the past week. And that's just a fun thing to be able to do, and a reminder of why it is the Perfect Day Coco Cay is such a fun thing. So it's also an indication for us that we're going to have a great time this upcoming April on board Independence of the Seas for our second ever DawgNation cruise. So we got a great travel agent who's helping with this. Her name is Jessica Slater. You can call her 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also visit a website that she's made for you, royaldogs.com. That is royaldogs.com, and you can be on board. It is crunch time. It's time to go ahead and make those final plans to be with us on board Independence of the Seas. We can't wait to see you there for all of that. All right, let me do a couple of SEC through stories before we speak to Jake Fromm here in a moment. I mentioned Marshawn Lloyd off the top of the show. Lloyd from South Carolina entering the transfer portal. It was not a good day for the Gamecocks yesterday because in addition to losing one of their top offensive players in Marshawn Lloyd, they also appear on the verge of losing another top offensive player in tight end Jaheim Bell. Bell is a guy that got a ton of attention in the offseason coming into this year, and now it appears they're about to lose two big offensive weapons on the same day. And I think this just sort of speaks to the way in which the transfer portal, for better or for worse, has really inserted a lot of chaos into the college football story, because think about how quickly it was just really a few days ago that South Carolina was sort of thought to have an incredible level of momentum to finish the season. You get a win against Tennessee. You scored 63 points in doing so. You get a win against your in-state rival in Clemson, something those Gamecocks fans have been craving. And you're kind of left to say, well, gosh, Shane Beamer couldn't have a much better season conclusion than what he had by going out there and getting those big wins. And now the transfer portal kind of changes that feeling, at least for the moment. When you lose a guy like Bell, when you lose a guy like Lloyd, it just goes to show you that right now the foundation on which college football stands is not very firm, and it can be easily shaken. And right now that may be the case there at South Carolina. They also appear on the verge of hiring an offensive coordinator, and there had been maybe some bigger names mentioned for a while, and it looks like instead it's going to be former tight ends coach at Arkansas, Dowell Lagans. I don't really know quite what this means. It certainly doesn't fit with some of the offensive coordinator stuff you've heard around the SEC as of late. Bobby Petrino maybe going to a place like Texas A&M, or even Liam Cohen coming back to a place like Kentucky. The Lagans news doesn't feel quite as substantial as that. But nonetheless, that appears to be what South Carolina is doing here. So their future a little bit uncertain right now after losing Satterfield, their guy, bringing in Lagans, and now losing a couple of big offensive names out of the portal. A little bit of uncertainty as it relates to that. Then one more story I'll get to here, and then we'll talk to Jake Fromm. Brett McMurphy, who now works for the Action Network, he is reporting that expansion of the SEC could end up actually happening a little earlier than was initially thought to be taking place, maybe 2024 now, for Texas and Oklahoma to join the league. There is a big payout that these schools have to give to the Big 12 for doing so, and that's one of the reasons why you thought it might not happen, any sooner than the actual contract would have suggested that it would. But now when you see Big 10 expansion, likely to happen very soon, when you see Big 12 expansion likely to take place, the SEC maybe going ahead and moving on and bringing in the Sooners, bringing in Texas, maybe that's now destined to take place a little sooner. We've been kind of in a weird position as of late. I've said this before. It's almost like there's kind of a lame duck situation in college football right now. We're in the kind of the final days of the 14 playoff and kind of the final days of the 14-team SEC with the two divisions. Well, maybe accelerating past that does kind of make some sense. Obviously, all this ends up kind of being about money, and so maybe they found the money to buy out the Big 12 and get to where they need to be. But one way or another, we may be closer. According to Brett McMurphy, who's pretty plugged in, we may be closer to getting to an expanded SEC maybe sooner than some folks thought. Maybe 2024, Texas and Oklahoma on their way to the SEC. We'll make that cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And with that said, let's get ready to do a Kroger Fresh Take right now and welcome in former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm. Always so happy to have Jake's time. I didn't get a chance to speak to Jake last week because I was out of town, but we're happy to have Jake back here today. Jake, welcome here to DawgNation Daily. We hope you're doing well. How are you?
Hey, Brandon, what's going on? Doing pretty good. Just got off the bye week, back at work, and yeah, excited to get rolling.
Absolutely. I hate to bring a sad thing into this discussion. I'm not even sure you're aware of this because I know you've been busy, but this morning it was made official that Mike Leach, the Mississippi State coach, has passed away. I don't know, in your time as a player, did you have any interaction with Leach or as a quarterback? You know, how much appreciation you might have had for the offenses that he ran? Any thoughts from you on the passing of Mike Leach here? Obviously, a lot of folks weighing in on that right now.
Yeah, saw the news this morning. Super sad to hear, man. Sudden, kind of out of nowhere. Just super sad for the state of Mississippi, for him, for his family, for the players as well. I know he's a great coach. He's touched a lot of guys and a lot of players, and he's going to leave a great legacy. And just super sad, honestly, to hear it, just because he meant to a lot to the guys that he touched.
I think that's well said. On a happier note, what was it like for you to watch Stetson Bennett this past week? They were in New York for the Heisman ceremony. There was obviously a little bit of backlash, kind of comparing him to Hendon Hooker, but I thought that Stetson did a great job in terms of how he spoke about this with the media, and I thought he represented Georgia very well at the Heisman ceremony. You know what it takes to be a quarterback at a place like Georgia and the level of pressure and attention you always have. What did you think of the last few days for Bennett getting a chance to be this program's first Heisman finalist since 1992?
Yeah, I mean, what a cool experience for him, for his family, and then also for the University of Georgia too. Get to have someone represent us up there. It's great. It's awesome. It's a huge honor. I know that he enjoyed it. I thought he spoke pretty well when getting hit with the questions, about all the stuff. And people are going to hate on Stetson. It just is what it is, and he knows that. And I think he handles it just unbelievably well. And then what a cool moment for him. Congrats to Caleb Williams on winning the Heisman. And I know Stetson's got bigger dreams in mind of moving forward to the next two games. So I know that's where his mindset's at.
We found out this week that Buster Faulkner is leaving Georgia to go be offensive coordinator at Georgia Tech. I know Faulkner came to UGA after you'd already left, but do you know Buster at all? Have you had any kind of interactions with him and maybe any kind of insight into what a guy like that has meant to this program?
Yeah, not huge. I've run into him a couple times in and out of the building, but great guy, great coach. Obviously, that quarterback room's played really well, and I know he has had a hand in that. I think it's pretty well deserved, and I know that he's excited for the opportunity that he has, and that's just part of being a part of a great program like Kirby's running here. Players are going to get accolades like Stetson going to Heisman, and then coaches are going to leave and take jobs like Coach Faulkner here, and then Coach Dan Lanning last year, and that's just kind of part of it when you run a really good program.
When you were playing, one of the things that Stetson has said is that Faulkner was kind of his. I'm making up this word. Stetson didn't use this word, but his kind of intermediary a little bit. That he wasn't talking to Todd Monken a lot during the game. That he was kind of talking with Buster Faulkner, was sort of speaking, sort of Monken's words, to Bennett. That Faulkner was kind of the go-between there. Did you have a guy like that when you were playing at Georgia? That was the guy that maybe you spent more time communicating with, and your offensive coordinator, whether that had been Jim Chaney or James Coley. Did you have a guy like that kind of functioned in that role for you?
Yeah, Coach Jay Johnson was a great intermediary for me, just because sometimes things get heated on the sideline or things not going well, or and he just would always put things in perspective, very calm, very positive too, and I think that's kind of what you need as an intermediary on the sidelines during game days, because they can get a little hectic and they get a little crazy. And for us as quarterbacks, we have 1,000 things going on through our head. We don't need a bunch of mess, a bunch of jumble. Just give us something short, something sweet, and help us get about to scoring drives, put points on the board.
And Johnson, a little bit the same kind of thing of, that was a former offensive coordinator that you guys had it as an analyst, and then he left to go be offensive coordinator at Colorado. That, it sort of speaks to the resources a place like Georgia has. If you've got, kind of Power 5 level offensive coordinators kind of working in that support staff analyst role, that's the kind of thing that just most programs won't be able to have. Georgia had that in Faulkner, and as you said, you kind of had that with Jay Johnson, who was an offensive coordinator sort of both before and after that tenure at UGA.
Yeah, I mean, that's just kind of part of it. I mean, I think Kirby has just done a great job of not only coaching his players, but of coaching his coaches too, as well. And when you have success as a program, everybody's going to have a hand in that success. And some people are going to get promotions and go out other places, and that's great for them.
I want to ask you about the big college football playoff showdown with Ohio State coming up, but let me remind folks, this is our Kroger Fresh Take with former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm here right now on DawgNation Daily. And, of course, Kroger's getting you ready for the holiday season because Kroger understands that today's holidays are tomorrow's memories. So you can find all the gifts and decor and all the things you need at Kroger.com/holiday. In fact, there's some great savings right now, too. You can buy one, get one on Russell Stover's candies and assorted holiday cards there. So that's an example of some of the great savings you can get. Christmas season being here, the decorations, the food, everything else you need to make it a great experience this month. Our friends at Kroger have got it for you. Kroger.com/holiday for more on that. Kroger.com/holiday for more on that. Jake, in addition to being a great player, you're also a big fan of this sport. You understand the history and the magnitude of it all. Georgia versus Ohio State in the college football playoff. It doesn't really get much bigger than that. What are your initial thoughts on that game? What was your reaction like when you kind of heard it was going to take place? And I guess how big of an advantage is it for Georgia to get a game like this in Atlanta? Any early thoughts on the Dogs and the Buckeyes?
Yeah, I mean, what a matchup. I think anytime you get the opportunity to go up against an historic program like an Ohio State, like in my past at Notre Dame, that is a great opportunity to just go out and show out. Man, I know that they're going to give us their best shot. I know they have a sour taste in their mouths the way they finished the season against Michigan. So I know they've been going to work here the past couple weeks because they've had some time off. I think it's a great matchup. I really do. Kind of gives me some Georgia versus Tennessee kind of vibes a little bit with their passing attack. But I know last week in the SEC Championship we didn't quite cover the receivers and have great pass defense here that last game. I don't think anyone has ever given up 500 yards of passing offense and still won a game by 20 points in a championship game, which is just so bizarre and nuts to me. I know Kirby is going to be with those guys a lot here in the next couple weeks, and they'll have a plan, get fixed up, and kind of revert back to that Tennessee plan. Ohio State knows that, so they'll have a few wrinkles mixed in. I'm excited to see what he comes up with.
Well, I'll let you go after this, Jake, but I kind of said this a little bit after that game, which is the entire sport seems to be playing 50 to 30 games all the time now, and the SEC Championship was a little bit of a reminder to me of why maybe Georgia doesn't typically play those kinds of games, because I'm not quite so sure that was all that much fun. I felt like I was pretty nervous. Georgia up 3 touchdowns in the fourth quarter, and I think I was still a little bit nervous because that game kind of got kind of wild there late, even though Georgia won comfortably. It was a little bit more wild for my, I guess, than my taste would have preferred.
Right. Yeah. It's hey, we're taking care of business, but also, man, they're fighting. They're staying in it.
That's right.
Nussmeier came in. He spun it. He ripped it really well. And their guys were getting open, man. So I don't think our defense quite expected that in their game plan. But I know they will be expecting it coming in to this next game against Ohio State.
Jay, great stuff. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate that. Congratulations on the continued work you're doing there in the NFL. Of course, we appreciate your thoughts here on what is a busy time for Georgia here, too. In fact, we'll look forward to doing it with you again here very soon.
Yeah, Brandon. Thank you very much, man. Y'all have a good one.
You too. Man, we're really lucky to get a chance to have a conversation like that with Jake Fromm, who kind of understands what it's like on the sidelines for a guy like Bennett and what it's like with the spotlight on him the way that it is. So Jake provides you great insight on all of that. Let's get ready to transition now and do a golden shoe. And, yesterday we had John Stinchcomb on the show, and I talked to John about Stetson Bennett in New York and how stylish Bennett looked wearing kind of the classic old-school letter jacket. I've seen former Georgia players wearing those letter jackets, or at least showing off those letter jackets before. And what I asked John Stinchcomb was, I said, John, do you have one of those Georgia letter jackets. And John said he thinks he does have one somewhere, although he wasn't exactly sure where it might be located. Well, our buddy Bassin Dog, who is a great, not just a figure on social media, but also apparently a pretty good sleuth here as well, he sent us a picture of not John Stinchcomb, but John's brother Matt wearing a jacket in question, much like the one we talked about yesterday. And so what Bassin says is, here's a picture of Matt Stinchcomb in his UGA Letterman jacket. That means John probably has the same thing. So there you go. I got to tell you, who wouldn't want to have one of those nice-looking letter jackets? That is a stylish look. Looks great on Matt Stinchcomb right there. It looks great on Stetson Bennett. I don't know. There's a former Georgia player looking to get rid of one. We maybe have to come up with a little bit of an NIL deal to see if we can make that happen, because that is a great-looking jacket. And so good job by Bassin Dog. We'll give you a golden shoe for your efforts there on that. And by the way, we'll also remind you, lousy, stinking Gators, not good to be a Gator these days, because they've got nothing but losses to the Georgia Bulldogs, and more of those coming in the future. In fact, another one 319 days from right now. That is our Gator Hater Countdown. We are Go for 2 in 22. And we'll see you tomorrow right here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And by the way, Michael also showing off the QR code there. That'll the place you go to get yourself the Go for 2 in 22 t-shirt. This is the original design on Go for 2 in 22, and it's great to go ahead and get that ready to go for Go for 2 in 22 season, because we're doing it big here over the course of the next few weeks. And if you want to be a part of it, you can go to dawgnation.store, top of the page of dawgnation.com. Or if you're watching a video, take out your phone and boom, just click that QR code and you can be in on all of this. So everything from a busy show is on the table. Talk about the Justice Haynes thing. Maybe your read on that different than mine. You want to talk about Buster Faulkner. You want to talk about transfer portal. Obviously, we'll continue to honor the life of Mike Leach. I thought Jake Fromm had some great things to say about that a moment ago. So all of it here today, and some of it sad, but we'll kind of take it wherever it goes with you on the program here. And with that said, we'll kind of pop over and go to YouTube here for a moment. By the way, I'll also tell you this. We are going to react to the news that comes out of Athens tomorrow afternoon live on video. We're going to do a Go for 2 in 22 special video program tomorrow, which we'll invite you to be a part of. So obviously there's not a specific time on this yet, but we're thinking somewhere around say 12:30, 1 p.m., something like that. You can be a part of that with us here. So you want to join us live via Zoom, we'll take your calls like a post-game show. We'll read your comments. We'll react to Kirby Smart's commentary. So we're going to do a Go for 2 in 22 special check-in tomorrow in the afternoon after our show. We'll do that tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. Jonathan Aaron wondering about how many of the Texas A&M, or as he calls them, Texas ATM players, Georgia's going to go after in the transfer portal since the mass exit. My guess is Georgia's shopping around right now a lot, whether it be a player from Texas A&M or anywhere else. My guess is that Georgia's looking a lot of guys here. Frederick Meredith checking in to say, BA, good to have you here. Charles Ross asking about Julian Juju Lewis, who, by the way, congratulations to Lewis as a freshman quarterback getting Carrollton all the way to the 7A state finals. That's an amazing performance, and I think that Lewis is setting himself up to be one of the most talked about recruits of all time. And in the one game that I saw Juju play this year, I thought he played outstanding. I think that, I think as a freshman quarterback, maybe there were moments this season where he kind of looked like a freshman every now and then, but I thought that he was very strong in the game that we saw him in. Obviously had a great run through the playoffs. So, yeah, my guess is that Georgia's going to very much try to get in on Lewis. There's a great photo I guess somebody had the other day of Lewis is like a second grader with Kirby Smart, which is just kind of funny. This is back when Smart was at Alabama. It's like, Smart's always the first one recruiting seemingly everybody, even a guy like Lewis, who's a freshman quarterback. That seems like that's early in the life to be recruiting a guy, and yet apparently Kirby was posing for photos with him even many years before that. Just kind of funny how that works out. But, yeah, I would say that Julian Lewis is a name to know, and one that Georgia, I'm sure, hopes to be very much involved with. I'm a SEC man says, do we get a photo of me running Coach O style shirtless on perfect day Coco K? Unfortunately, I don't quite look shirtless as good as Ed Orgeron does, to be completely honest with you. I wish that I did. Don't quite do that. So I don't know that I'll subject any of you to see me shirtless, but I am looking forward to being there with all of y'all and coming up in April. Jay Shipe says, which quarterback does Faulkner take with him? I think back. Man, Georgia quarterback ain't going to Georgia Tech. Buster Faulkner's leaving because they offered him a on-field coaching job. He's not taking one of these quarterbacks with him, I don't think. Come on, Jay. You're better than that. Brian McCanahan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, says, I work in Port Canaveral and was quite the VIP cruise you went on. Hope you were treated like a VIP. I was, Brian. Thank you very much. We had a great time. Royal Caribbean was nice enough to offer us the chance to be on what was kind of a promotional cruise for them. And Brian, I didn't realize you're down there at the port. Next time we're there, I'll try to find a way to say hello to you because I'd love to meet you. But, yeah, we had a great time. It was really fun. Really fun. Let's see what else. Jay Shipe says, do I want to bet? No, I'm not going to bet on anything, but at least as it relates to the transfer portal, because I guess anything can happen, but I don't expect that to happen. Buddy Lee Z says, do I sit and watch the UGA pass games? I do a lot. One of the things I do from time to time is I try to go to the elliptical every day, and, sometimes you just kind of, listen to music or something like that. But every now and then it kind of gets to be a little tiresome at the end, and you're trying to really kind of get that last little bit to get you across the finish line. So that's when I'll kind of dial up some great moments in Georgia history and kind of watch some whatever I can find on YouTube, just sort of get you through that. I do a lot of that kind of thing. Let's see what else. Frederick Meredith says, to this admittedly untrained eye, it's difficult for me to see where the holes are going to be on this Georgia roster heading into 2023, even if Georgia didn't go into the portal at all. Yeah, I mean, like the one thing that Georgia's always going to try to do is maximize its full potential. So in the NFL, I'm a big believer that the draft is about best player available, that, draft for needs, draft best player available. I'm a big believer that the best teams are going to draft best player available. And over the course of many years of stacking best players available, as, hopefully smart people have evaluated them, eventually you'll have a better overall roster than you will drafting for need and sort of trying to fit a round hole into a round peg or something like that, a round peg into a round hole. Collecting best player available over the course of years is just the best way to build a roster. And so I think there's some of that when it comes to the transfer portal for Georgia right now too, where you may say, oh, well, Georgia's got an immediate need for a wide receiver or edge rusher or running back, whatever you may say. But what Georgia really always has a need for is elite-level talent, and elite-level talent you can get access to and have that initial conversation with and kind of further that relationship with. That there is an element of transfer portal management that probably will be and certainly should be about, hey, what kind of best player available can you acquire here? Because ultimately, it's always good to add elite talent, even if that elite talent doesn't necessarily represent an immediate need. Let's see what else on YouTube here for a moment. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says we really only hit the portal for very obvious holes in the roster, cornerback or wide receiver we're going after. Yeah, I mean, look, Kirby Smart has said that even though Georgia did not take a transfer portal player this year, it's not like they didn't try to take one. And Smart's been pretty honest about that. So, this idea that Georgia feels like the transfer portal is beneath it, that's not an accurate reflection of how Georgia views this. I think that Georgia, rightly so, probably would say it's a mistake to add a lot of players from the transfer portal, that 8, 9, the way that some people do. I think that Georgia would probably view that as a mistake, and frankly, they don't have enough room to be able to do that anyway. But it's not like Georgia thinks the transfer portal is beneath them. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a misnomer out there that that Georgia has a wildly different view of the transfer portal and a wildly different view of NIL than some programs do. I think there's a little bit of a misnomer out there about that. That, obviously, Georgia's not going to lead with NIL as its number one recruiting pitch to a player, but I don't think there's really any indication that Georgia's doing any less with NIL than any other program is doing either. And transfer portal-wise, Georgia doesn't have as obvious a collection of needs as some programs do, so maybe there are other programs who are more desperate for the portal than Georgia is. But it's not like Georgia's evaluating the available options in the transfer portal less than anyone else is. That you think about like the big board of all the available names, Georgia is just as intently looking at all of those, as much window shopping as anybody is. So, Georgia's a very strong program, and from a position of strength, it doesn't have to act as openly desperate as maybe some other programs do. But there's a little bit, I think, of a misunderstanding that somehow, Georgia feels like NIL and transfer portal, the two main mechanisms that have kind of come of age in the last couple of years, those types of things are beneath it as a program. And I don't think there's any indication that's true at all. That Georgia's, for the most part, doing with NIL what most other programs are doing, and it's evaluating the transfer portal the same way that most other programs are doing as well. It just doesn't have as much room to bring guys in, nor does it really have a need for as many guys. But they're just as interested when the portal name pops up as anybody else is. Worm says Kirby will not portal anyone that won't fit with the team, and that is certainly true. That Georgia does really value that team concept, and they're very careful about protecting that. And that's not just lip service. They do mean that. I think you're right about that. Let me go to Facebook here for a moment. On Facebook. Sorry for the delay. Here we go. Ken Holcomb says, what do you think about GHSA going to video replay in championship games after that horrible call in the Cedar Grove versus Sandy Creek game? I'm in favor of it. I think that would be an appropriate thing to do. I think one of the issues that's kind of held back on the replay stuff is, and what has always made sense to me, is that during the regular season, I guess the availability of video at every venue where high school football is taking place is so, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess inconsistent, right? It's like, some places have lots of video availability, and some, places where games are played, some stadiums don't have quite as much. So how would you use an instant replay process during the regular season? I don't know that there's necessarily an easy answer to that, but it would obviously be very easy to do that during the postseason. So the one concern I'd kind of have is I don't like it when postseason games are so different from regular season games. It's one of the reasons why I don't love, the 6,000 limit or minimum requirement for these semifinal games, because you're taking games that have been played on campus and doing that, and all of a sudden now you're putting them in kind of a neutral site venue, a situation like this, which takes the crowd out of the game in a lot of ways. I like for the postseason to feel as much like the regular season as possible, but when the technology is available to you to get the call right via instant replay, especially given the fact that some neighboring states to Georgia are doing this, I think it's time for Georgia to get pretty serious about doing that. Logistically, obviously, there's some issues. You don't want to make the games, any longer necessarily, but if you have a chance to get the call right or correct obvious calls from being wrong, I think, of course, you'd want to do that. So maybe the unintended sort of byproduct of what happened between Cedar Grove and Sandy Creek the other night is maybe it does accelerate the process of bringing instant replay to Georgia, something that probably would have happened anyway eventually. Maybe that means it happens sooner. Maybe that's kind of the right thing to do. Let's see what else. So Rick Martin and David Faulkner are talking about this. I didn't know this. I heard this the other day that John Dewberry, who was quarterback at Tech when I was a kid, I guess started off at Georgia. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that. I think he's also a big real estate guy now too. But I didn't know that. Rick Martin says, I'm skeptical about your NIL assessment of the UGA. Yeah, I mean, listen, there are obviously a lot of programs that have made NIL the forefront and almost the exclusive recruiting pitch they have. Think about a Miami, think about a Texas A&M. Certainly in the case of Miami, that's like the only offer that they're making. But if Georgia wasn't playing the NIL game at all, they wouldn't be getting any recruits, right? Because that's just kind of look, it's evolved very, very fast. Things have changed very, very quickly. And if you're not participating in this at kind of a similar level to everybody else is, then you're just going to get left behind. And Georgia's clearly not getting left behind. So it's almost like an algebraic equation. Well, if that be the case, then Georgia is likely doing about what most everybody else is doing. And that's the conclusion that I'm forced to draw here. And obviously, I don't believe that Georgia wants the kind of player who only cares about NIL, because that becomes a very difficult player to kind of get into the fabric of your program, to kind of ingrain into the fabric of your program. But I just believe it's just likely that Georgia is doing from an NIL standpoint about what everybody else is doing. Mike Mazzell, going back to the topic of Mike Leach, something we talked about a good bit on today's show, incredibly sad. It just kind of shakes you to your core in a lot of ways. Denise Loper also saying that puts kind of a dark cloud over football today, and I think you're right about that. Mike Mazzell, Scotty Barnes also talking about that too. Just really sad. Scary too. Scary. Very scary. Randy Hall, Jason Alex also talking about the AP All-American team. I wanted to talk about that today. We just didn't quite have time. We'll talk about it more coming up. But certainly Georgia well represented on all that. Ryan Walker checks in to say the ace in the hole for the Dogs passing game is going to be AD, Blaylock, and Kearis Jackson. While everyone is doubling OSU, won't know how to stop them due to the limited film on them this year. Hey, you may be right about that, Ryan. I certainly hope you are. That'd be great. It's fun to consider. Yeah, so going back to Randy's initial comment about the AP All-Americans, he says the Big Ten had 22, the SEC had 15, ACC had 10, and all three teams, surprised the Big Ten had the most, especially along the offensive line. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. Georgia, had 2 first-teamers, 4 in total on the 2 teams. So, I mean, I think one of the things you kind of get to is what wins a national championship for you. Last year, it's great players making big plays late in seasons. And it's the same thing for Georgia here right now. Those AP-level All-Americans, guys like Jalen Carter and others, they're Christopher Smith, they're going to be called upon to be at their best in these biggest moments. And, it becomes a little bit of a superstar sport here late in the year, and how many total kind of superstar level players, whether you measure that by All-American or first team All-SEC or future first-round picks, how many of those superstar type players does Georgia have? How many of those does Ohio State have? And how many of those can be kind of leaned on and called upon to do something big in a game like this? That's what a lot of this ends up being about. Let's see what else. Taj Raheem with a suggestion for Georgia in the transfer portal. That's an interesting name to consider. Barry Watkins wonders how many running backs we're losing in the NFL. Certainly, obviously, Kenny McIntosh, you expect to be on that, and you kind of see what happens with a guy like Kendall Milton as well. So Georgia could have a pretty big need at the running back spot. John Collins, going back to the subject of Mike Leach, saying we are not guaranteed tomorrow. And, that is one of those things that I have had to deal with a lot lately. And I don't know. It just sort of feels like there's certain times in your life where sort of death just sort of surrounds you. And I'm just being honest here for a moment. We're kind of right around the time 2 years ago when my dad passed away, and my grandmother right now is very, very sick. And it just sort of feels like everywhere you turn, you're sort of dealing with death. And that means when a famous person dies, like a Mike Leach, or you had the soccer writer that passed away at the World Cup, I think you stop and consider those kinds of things more than you might at a different point in time in your life. Because when I was younger, a decade ago, something like that, someone's passing did not impact me really at all. And I hate to be this way, I'm just being honest. It probably did not really impact me at all because I was still of the age in which I thought I was going to live forever, as dumb as that sounds. And yet when you see from your own family or people that you know, when you see them kind of in their end of life situation, it does kind of serve as a reminder. It kind of cuts through your narcissism or whatever else and kind of gets to the core of the fact that, hey, one of these days you will be in an end of life scenario too. And so when you have kind of that mindset, and then a famous person, or at least someone that you kind of know from the internet or, know from having seen on TV, when they pass away, it just kind of hits you in a little bit different sort of way. And I think a lot of us are kind of maybe reacting that way to the Mike Leach part of that. And I don't know, it can almost make you crazy if you think too much about it, because sometimes it sort of makes me feel like I'm getting crazy. I think, so much about that kind of stuff. But the only response that seems to make any sense in light of all that is, as people are saying in the comment section today, is you have just got to embrace every day, and you have just got to try to soak it in and get the most out of every single moment with the ones you love, doing the stuff that you love, or whatever. You try to leave your mark on the world, hopefully make the world a better place. You just got to do that, because there is no way to sugarcoat. It gets ugly at the end. There's just no way to sugarcoat that. And making the most of the time before that, it's all of our jobs. And I hate to be so, matter of fact about that, but that's just the way it goes. Craig Jones says, I'm 61, had a favorite aunt pass away Saturday, and my dad in May. Life is a gift. We are mortal. Serve God and love people while we can. That's really why we're here. Football is for fun. I think that's right. I do. And I do think that the fun stuff about football makes all of that a little bit easier, right? And that's one of the things I start to appreciate about the game when I spend time around it, is that football cultivates relationships, and relationships are ultimately the only currency that really matters. Or football kind of stands as a little bit of a teaching tool for the kind of toughness that we need to endure all of this, because the kind of scary stuff that people are talking about today, that would be overwhelming if not for that little bit of toughness that we all kind of develop over the course of time to say, in light of all of this, we are going to endure. In light of all of this, we're going to kind of push through. And I do think that football kind of helps model that in a lot of ways. So, while football, as the commenter said, is just for fun, it's the kind of fun that can also serve a larger purpose, because it brings us closer to people. We have that shared experience, but it also kind of indicates how it is that you handle what would otherwise be a very difficult situation. Ken Holcomb, I send prayers to you there as well. Ken, I'm sure a lot of people feel similarly to you, and so I send prayers to you on all of that. Let me go to dawgnation.com here for a moment. Trippy Charlie checks in. I always love that username. He says, Bennett's fourth place finish. Heisman, do you think that makes the chip on Bennett's shoulder even bigger? So I talked about this a little bit yesterday, and maybe it does, but I think a real big mistake would be to say, in light of a weekend in which Bennett was center stage, that all of a sudden the college football playoff semifinal in the Peach Bowl becomes a referendum on him one way or another, that he either plays well and shows that he should have won the award, or he plays poorly and shows that, in the eyes of some, that he shouldn't have been a finalist at all. That's never really been what Georgia's about. Georgia is not a quarterback-driven team. And listen, Stetson Bennett, I believe, was a worthy Heisman finalist. But even in the midst of that, he is just one of the very good things going on in a place like Georgia. And as we kind of tried to say yesterday, it'd be a mistake to all of a sudden now change the narrative for a team in Georgia that has been about complementary football, offense helping defense, defense helping offense, and now say, hey, this is a Wild West gunslinger showdown between the quarterback on the Georgia side, Stetson Bennett, and the quarterback on the Georgia side, on the Ohio State side, C.J. Stroud, and whichever of these two quarterbacks plays better is the one that's going to win the game. That's just not really been what Georgia's about. And I say that knowing full well and believing full well that Bennett will very likely go out and have an outstanding game, because that's what he's typically done in these very big games for Georgia in recent years. But it's going to take more than just Stetson Bennett for Georgia to be able to win this game. It's going to take all the other things that always seem to go along with that, lines of scrimmage, defense, and everything else. And so while I do believe that Bennett will be motivated to play well, and obviously maybe he does have a little bit of irritation with the fact that even though he was a Heisman finalist, he was the lowest rated of the Heisman finalists in terms of the final vote. Ultimately, I just don't want this Peach Bowl to be a referendum on Stetson one way or another. This is a referendum on all the things that Georgia does well. Georgia won the national championship last year playing complementary football with all sides, both sides of the ball aiding the other. And that's still, to me, the recipe here right now. And that's, I think we'll be reminded of how true that is as you get closer to the game. Rome Dog says, any news on transfer portal offers? We know that Ra Thomas, the wide receiver from Mississippi State, was in Athens this past weekend, so you'll take that very seriously. There is some thought of, hey, maybe a guy like Marshawn Lloyd, who Georgia recruited as a high school running back. Now that he's leaving South Carolina, maybe Georgia will get involved on that. But for me right now, that's just kind of connecting dots. It's not necessarily, reporting or anything like that. But the odds are you're going to see more names pop up like this. Of a guy like Lloyd is one that we all remember, those of us who follow recruiting, we all remember that being a pretty big name for Georgia for a while. And so the odds are other names like that will kind of pop up too. In other words, if you're if you're following this stuff pretty closely, and Rome Dog, I know you are, some of the names that you may see go into the portal could be some of those names of, well, obviously Georgia would be interested in this guy because they were very interested in this guy before. You may see more of that kind of take place. Senior Dog 54 says that Branson Robinson would get 15 to 20 carries per game next year, which is hard to do in Georgia's current system. I believe he could rush for 1,200 or more yards. Listen, I think Robinson's got a very bright future, and I hope he gets a chance to show more of that this year. I do. Scott Harris says Mississippi State scares me for Monken more so than Purdue. Monken has ties to the state. Could be the case. I mean, look, if a big-time head coaching job were to come calling for Todd Monken, it'd be hard for him to say no to that. I think that Purdue might be an example of that. You mentioned Mississippi State. They're about to go into a coaching search. I don't really quite know for them what that's going to look like, just because this is a little bit of uncharted territory. At least we don't see this happen, very much. But there is certainly a possibility that Georgia can lose Todd Monken. That's absolutely a possibility. I think it would take a lot to lose him. It'd have to be a pretty big job because he's paid very well to do the job that he currently has, and that job doesn't require him to do some of the things that maybe he doesn't want to do as much. I mean, go to the DawgNation YouTube page. The speech that he gave at the Broyles thing the other night, that's a pretty salty speech. I don't really quite know how well that plays every single place he could go in terms of, being a head coach. I mean, it's no nonsense, and to a certain extent, a lot of people probably really like it. But given the sort of typical sort of touchy-feely stuff, warm, fuzzy feelings your head coach is supposed to conjure up, I don't know quite how easily Todd Monken conjures all of that up right now. And I say that with great respect because he's a terrific coach. But, just understanding that he doesn't love playing that part of the game quite as much, it'd take probably a pretty good offer to get Monken to leave. But given the success that Georgia has had with him offensively, that really good offer may eventually come, probably will at some point in time. You just can't really expect to keep him forever. In other words, if Georgia being great requires holding on to every one of the current assistant coaches they have, then they won't be able to do that because you're not going to be able to hold on to all these guys. But the mechanism for greatness is, when you lose a guy, can you replace him with someone who's equally capable? And by the way, maybe we'll do this in the show at some point in time. If you look at why Clemson as a program is eroding, this may be it. That when they lost key and valued assistants, they did not replace them quite as well. They did not, rebuild that coaching rank as well as they probably could. And Dabo Swinney is a coach I'm not being snarky. I'm just trying to be as honest as I can be. That Dabo's kind of always been a little bit more of the figurehead, rah-rah type head coach. Dabo is not doing as much of the hardcore coaching. He's never been a coordinator before. So Dabo may be a little bit more coordinator dependent than some other programs might be. And so when you see, a Venables leave, they've lost a couple of different offensive coordinators over the years. When they're losing these guys, eventually that kind of catches up to you. And I would say that right now Dabo's got a pretty weak staff. At least it seems like on the outside looking in, that's a pretty weak staff at Clemson. And because of that, Clemson's kind of no longer a college ball playoff level program. And so obviously the thought would be if Georgia were to lose a Monken, or if you were to lose in future years a guy like Glenn Schumann, or there have been all kinds of rumors about stuff that might go down as you lose. Maybe Will Muschamp wants to be a head coach again. As you lose guys like this, can Georgia replace them with someone who's just as effective? That's going to be Kirby Smart's job. And the one thing that Kirby also has going for him here is that while Dabo doesn't really have the coaching acumen to kind of get under the hood and kind of really do the hard coaching work, that's something that Kirby Smart certainly can do because he was a defensive coordinator for a very long time. Nola Dog said Monken hated Mississippi State when he was at Southern Miss. I couldn't imagine him swallowing pride to take that job. Well, maybe that's the case, but it's also an SEC head coaching job. If offered the chance, he might take it. But, there's obviously a lot of, things to be, take place before anything like that could ever be a serious conversation one way or another. All right, around the comment sections one more time. We'll get ready to go. Kirby's Visor says, 8 more Buckeyes. I like that. Florida Dog says, beat Ohio. I like that there as well. Ryan Harris, glad to have you checking in live today. Thanks for being here, Ryan. It's good to have you here. Appreciate that. And thanks for listening on Spotify. Normally, we appreciate that too. Podcast still, doing really well, which I'm always very thankful for. Great to see. Jay Shipe's always funny in here. Let's see what else. Buddy Lee Z says, do you have any memories of when the questions we've asked made you laugh when you're off the air? Kind of. Here's what kind of happens more than anything else is sometimes I'll see something happen and it'll make me think of what people in the comment section would likely say about that, because there is an element of this portion of the show that's very different than the other stuff that we kind of do. And so there are things that we talk about here that just don't come up on the show very much. For instance, y'all giving me grief about, say, Jimbo Fisher or something like that. That's the kind of thing that the average person who only watches what I sort of think of as the regular show wouldn't have any knowledge of whatsoever. So one of the things that probably kind of gets me laughing sometimes is when something like that occurs that I know will be a big deal to commenters in a way that might not be quite as much of a thing for like the actual regular show, if that makes sense. Crow King 123 says Mississippi State's a more appealing job than Purdue. I'll say that. I think that's right. Now, I also believe that in the midst of kind of some of this conversation, that I think there's been a little bit of an underrating of the Purdue job. In the future, there are two leagues that are so head and shoulders above everything else, Big Ten and the SEC. I just don't know that anybody in the future, if you aspire to be a head coach, and maybe at this point in time, Monken just doesn't anymore. Maybe there's a chance that's the case. But if you aspire to be a head coach, I don't believe anybody in the future is turning down a Big Ten head coaching job, because there is so much money connected to this. There's just so much money. And, in the future, we're not even sure, like, say, the Pac-12 is going to exist anymore. It probably will, but there's a chance that it doesn't. The Big 12 is a league that is about to take on a very different shape because it's losing its current flagship members, Texas and Oklahoma, and it's adding the likes of Cincinnati and UCF, and you're kind of left to wonder, what does that really mean for the new look Big 12? That's a little bit of an unstable league. If the ACC, for instance, looks like a very weak league right now. I don't just mean the quality of the teams. I mean the actual league itself. They have a long-term media rights deal in place that doesn't pay their member schools very much money, and if you didn't have the long-term contract in place, then the league would probably just disband all the way around. It's kind of a double-edged sword, that the thing that holds the ACC together is this long-term contract, and yet the long-term contract is a little bit of a yoke around the program's neck because it doesn't pay the schools very much money individually. But if you didn't have such a long-term deal, you'd have so many ACC schools trying to bolt to go to other leagues that the conference would probably just dissolve just like that. That the scenario in the other three of what we think of as Power 5 leagues right now is just really either not good, obviously, or maybe questionably not so good either, that in the future, the future is just so much brighter for a Big Ten or for an SEC that if you're offered one of those jobs, you're just probably not turning it down. Let's see what else. Paul Moon says, I really don't want Bobo as our offensive coordinator again. Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, a lot of Georgia fans obviously feel that way. Here's what I'll tell you, is that when Bobo was offensive coordinator, I was probably a bigger fan of him as a coordinator than some other people were. For instance, I thought that Bobo, by the end of his tenure as offensive coordinator last year in 2014, I mean, I thought the Georgia offense was actually functioning pretty highly, right? In a year like that, they were, I think, leading the SEC in scoring. And I thought that was a pretty high functioning offense. And you'll say, what about the goal line situation against South Carolina? This is when Todd Gurley didn't get the football. That's a fair criticism. That was an incorrect call, I believe, on the part of Mike Bobo. It was an incorrect call. But I don't think that changes the over. I mean, a lot of people make a mistake in the moment, but still a pretty good coach. I really thought that Bobo was a very good offensive coordinator. I actually thought that the biggest mistake of that era was I thought that he was poorly treated by Georgia. I don't know, and I love Coach Richt. I love him and revere him and will do so forever. I don't know that Richt fought to get Bobo as much money as he possibly could. And I don't think that Bobo was paid well enough. And I think it's ridiculous that, Bobo was making like $500,000 at Georgia for doing a good job. And then when he leaves in 2015, Brian Schottenheimer comes in He was paid basically twice what Bobo was paid to do about half as good a job as offensive coordinator. So the issue that existed with Georgia at that time, I don't think was about Bobo being ineffective as an offensive coordinator. It was about, I think that Bobo at times was not properly appreciated for the work that he was doing. And listen, that's all, water under the bridge now, and relitigating the past may not make a ton of sense. So I don't really know what Georgia would do if it lost Monken, and with now Buster Faulkner moving on. I don't know that Georgia would try to go back and get Faulkner, or it would try to promote Mike Bobo, or maybe Mike Bobo was kind of always destined to be that guy. I'm not really quite so sure what they would do in that respect. But I do believe that Bobo was a better coordinator when at Georgia than some of y'all seem to think that he was. Ryan Harris says that Bobo was also under unfair scrutiny, like the anti-national championship Stetson Bennett haters, under the microscope too much. Yeah, I mean, like, to me, what happened with Mike Bobo is that the easiest thing to criticize in any given moment is the play calling for whatever football team. You just turn on whatever sports radio. It's always so easy to say this about the play calling. The fact that Todd Monken has gotten so little of that gives you an idea of just how effective Monken's been as an offensive coordinator, that the easiest, most knee-jerk reaction to provide in the immediate aftermath of a football game, Monken has just never really gotten very much of that. I think it sort of speaks to what how well Todd Monken has done. And a lot of what Mike Bobo, I believe, got was just sort of the regular stuff that offensive coordinators sort of always get. For whatever reason, it became more amplified. But, play callers get criticized. It's just kind of the way that it goes. John Hendricks says if Monken were to leave, you can trust Kirby to find a very capable replacement. A lot of coaches would want to come to Athens. I think that's right. And there's no doubt that Georgia, I think, has kind of gotten used to the level of offense that a guy like Monken has provided. Now, the one thing I would not want, this was a failure this year at Kentucky. We've seen this fail other places. I would not want to hire someone to run Todd Monken's offense because that never seems to work. I would want to bring in an offensive mind, let that guy run it the way that he wanted to run it. Because when you try to bring in somebody, even if it's a smart guy, like the Falcons a couple of years ago, brought in Steve Sarkisian to run Kyle Shanahan's offense. It was a total failure. Sarkisian's a brilliant play caller, but trying to run an offense that wasn't his own did not seem to work. And so whatever Georgia were to do in the event that Monken were to move on, I would hope it's a guy to run his system and not a guy to try to replicate Todd Monken's system, because that doesn't ever seem to really work. Spencer Clark says you don't like Brian McClendon. I love Brian McClendon. I love McClendon. I mean, I would want an experienced play caller being offensive coordinator. I would. To me, the play caller thing is not something you play around with. So I think that Brian McClendon is an incredibly valuable part of this coaching staff. I do. I would like to have the offensive coordinator in the event that Georgia needed one be someone that has a long track record of calling plays, because that's one of those things. I've said this before. To me, and Todd Monken actually said a version of this the other day, although his thing is different than mine. To me, a coaching staff is a little bit like a rock band. A head coach is like the lead singer. There's a lot of different ways to be a lead singer. You can be a good singer. You can be charismatic. You can be good looking. You can be quirky. You can be whatever. There's a lot of different ways to be a front man for a rock band. There's only one way to be a lead guitarist, and that's you got to be able to play the instrument. To me, that's what an offensive coordinator is like. He's like your lead guitarist. The only thing that matters is how well you play the instrument, how well you call the plays. And there's just only really one way to do that job, which is punch buttons that score points. And so if Monken were to move on, I would not want to experiment with offensive coordinator. I'd want to bring in someone who has a long track record of scoring points somewhere. I would want that. Let's see what else. Let me go back to the other comment sections here for a moment. Randy Hall asking on another note, one of the Braves make the trade it made yesterday? I have to admit, I don't really understand this. And there may be a good reason for it. I'm going to miss Contreras. I really liked him. My son loved Contreras. It's always sad to see when your son's favorite players move on. So there may end up being a good reason. I'm not quite as plugged into Major League Baseball as I used to be. But at first glance, it seems like the Braves gave away kind of a lot for, I'm not really quite so sure, what they're getting back here. So I have to say I'm probably confused about that too. Greg Baker says, why aren't we hyping Georgia versus Michigan for the Joe Moore Award? Maybe we should be doing more about that. That's obviously something that Cedric Von Prine-Granger said they really wanted to win this year. Michigan won it last year. So maybe we should be hyping that more, Greg. Maybe we should be. I'll look more into that because it would be a big deal. It'd be nice to see Georgia win it. They've been a finalist before, but they never won it. Chris Slim White said, but I would be okay with Bobo, who has a long track record for losing. Well, I didn't necessarily even say I'd be okay with Mike Bobo. I'm not endorsing Bobo. First of all, the job's not open because Todd Monken's not going anywhere as of right now. I mean, let's first of all establish this, that Georgia does not have an opening at offensive coordinator. And I haven't. If in the event that Georgia did have an offensive coordinator opening, I'm not openly endorsing Bobo. I just said that I think that Bobo is probably a better coordinator than some folks going to give him credit for. Kent Holcomb said that Braves trade may have been the first bad one for AA. At first glance, I don't love it, but we'll see what comes of it. Barry Watkins also pointing out the Dansby Swanson still remains unsigned. Yeah, the Dansby contract is probably heading for a pretty big one. I don't know if the Braves are capable of matching that. Clinton Thrift says, who do you want us to play after the Buckeyes? I kind of like Georgia's chances against either Michigan or TCU. I guess TCU to be the easier of the two games. Although it'd be kind of fun to think you could win a national championship by going through both Ohio State and Michigan. That'd be pretty fun. Let's see what else. Adam Henderson says that going back to the Bobo era, the defense was bad then, not Bobo. Yeah, I mean, look, I can't stand the idea of relitigating the past here, but to watch the Georgia offense in, like, say, 2012 and portions of 2013 and, a good bit of 2014, the idea that the 2014 was just bathing in talent, I'm not quite so sure that was the case. They had an incredible running back talent, but they didn't have all of that at the same time, right? You had, Todd Gurley for a portion of the year. In fact, let's look this up for a second. Now I'm curious. So you had Todd Gurley for a portion of the year. And you had Nick Chubb, who came in after Gurley got suspended and then got injured. And let's see what Georgia did that year. So go back to 2014 for a moment. Georgia scored 41.3 points per game in 2014 with, not exactly a laundry list of offensive superstars outside of the running backs. And they had amazing running backs. They did have amazing running backs, but they weren't exactly bathing in talent other areas. So they scored 41.3 points in 2014. The year after Bobo left in 2015, Georgia scored, oh my gosh, 26.3 points per game. Is that right? So Georgia from year over year, Bobo's last year, 41.3. 2015, a team that, by the way, still had Nick Chubb and still had Sonny Michel, although Chubb did get hurt. They averaged 26.3 points per game. So I'm not telling you that means that Mike Bobo is the smartest offensive mind ever, and I'm not saying that I would want him to be offensive coordinator if Todd Monken were to leave. I'm simply saying that some of y'all need to give him a little bit more credit. 2013, they still averaged 36.7 points per game. This is pre-Chubb and Michelle. This is a year in which Aaron Murray got hurt. 2012, 37.8, good enough for third in the SEC, right there alongside Alabama. So some of those offenses are pretty good. And obviously Aaron Murray put up big numbers there as well. All right. Final comments. 2014, Aaron Murray was not the quarterback in 2014. Hudson Mason was the quarterback in 2014. So a little bit different level of quarterback there with that. All right, let me go back to Facebook. Final comments, we're going to go. Clinton Thrift says, quit looking at points per game. Look at the schedule with those years. I mean, was the schedule – I don't understand what your point is there on that. I guess I didn't realize an SEC schedule was was soft. Plus, in 2014, they played Clemson. In fact, if you want to do that, we can do that too. Like I said, I'm not even arguing for him to be the offensive coordinator, but this is not. So they put 45 on Clemson, and then against the SEC schedule, they did what they did. Yes, I don't. What kind of schedule do you want them to play? Like, what would you need to do? What kind of schedule would be required to make that level of points scored and something impressive? And as I said before, I'm not necessarily touting him for offensive coordinator. I'm just saying that when people want to make a certain argument, they will make that argument no matter what the facts say, and this is kind of an example of that. Let's see what else. Keith Foles says, "Go you hairy dogs, beat the Buckeyes." Totally agree with you on that. Denise White-Loper says Munkin's going to make $1 million in bonuses after the national championship. Yeah, listen, Munkin's well paid now. He's well paid. And, I don't know that it's necessarily obvious that – I don't really know what Mike Bobo wants. I mean, I should say that Todd Munkin wants to do. But, this idea that he's, got one foot out the door at Georgia, I don't know that that's necessarily obvious. Now, if he gets Nick Bonanno also pointing out that Mike Bobo could recruit. Yeah, listen, that's an offensive coordinator that was a very involved figure in a lot of non-offensive recruits. Like Bobo, knew that South Georgia region like the back of his hand. I mean, he was a major factor in some big recruits too. That's an offensive coordinator who's getting his hands dirty in recruiting there as well. Like I said, I'm not arguing for him to be the offensive coordinator. Georgia doesn't have an opening in offensive coordinator, but gosh, the misremembering of the past here is kind of amazing. All right, final comments. We got to go. It's late. I got to go right now. All right. Hey, thanks for being here, y'all. Check out the AJC online, ajc.com. If you want to follow the future for Buster Faulkner now at Georgia Tech, or if you want to follow what did go down with that Braves trade yesterday, try to make sense of some of that, you can get that all. There's also a very sad killing in the Buckhead area. Very, very sad situation there. So you can find out more about that online, ajc.com on that. And as one of our commenters mentioned, I guess instant replay now will be considered more strongly in high school football after the controversial conclusion to the Sandy Creek Cedar Grove game. So you can get more on that online as well, ajc.com. Also to our friends at R.S. Andrews. Thanks for making the R.S. Andrews cool down possible. Air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. You can trust R.S. Andrews on all of that today, including if your water heater goes out. In many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. But you got to find them online at rsandrews.com. So you have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.